Welcome back to The Run. We're talking about what kind of centralized energy plan the next president should pursue, if any. Let's consider what one extremely centralized organization is doing about it, the Department of Defense. The Quadrennial Defense Review is one of those rare government products that is what it claims to be. It's a review of defense priorities, and it comes out every 4 years. Here's what they had to say last year about climate change. Quote, "The impacts of climate change may increase the frequency, scale, and complexity of future missions, while at the same time undermining the capacity of our domestic installations. Our actions to increase energy and water security, including investments in energy efficiency, new technologies, and renewable energy sources, will increase the resiliency of our installations and help mitigate these effects." The Pentagon goes on to refer to the effects of global warming as, quote, "threat multipliers that will aggravate stressors abroad such as poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that can enable terrorist activity and other forms of violence." Not sure where to start with that. How about the fact that these flower children at DoD say that global warming is a global threat multiplier? Jonathan, turn down your AC and stop a war? What do you think?
I don't know where this stuff comes from. I mean, the whole issue of climate change, it seems to be more than any other issue, one that's treated from a point of view of wholesale ignorance by people. Climate change clearly is taking place, and there's a good deal of evidence that it's caused, an enormous amount of evidence that it's caused by fossil fuel emissions. Since about 1960, I think there's been about a 0.6 degree Celsius degree of increase in average mean global surface temperature, which is significant. It's not enormous, but it's very significant. But the idea that if we see continued increases in temperature, that we're going to see wars based on increases in surface temperature, maybe in the long range horizon, but not immediately. The immediate causes of wars are people in conflict with one another over things like religion, national resources, politics, culture, language.
What does Jonathan know that DoD does not?
I mean, what you get in terms of the wars possibly happening from this is you get climate change, you get rising sea levels that dislocates the populations. Those populations have to go somewhere. They get into conflict with other people in other areas. So Ban Ki-moon has actually said that he thinks the Darfur tragedy, he said this in an editorial, was partially caused, if not wholly caused, by climate change and desertification that happened from that. When you had the tribalists of the pastoral, the nomads, when you had desertification, they came in and they needed land down in the lowlands where there's water. And the farmers were enclosing their areas when in the past they hadn't done so. So this actually caused conflict. And that's the kind of conflict that you're seeing the Pentagon call out.
Overgrazing of the Sahel is something that's been going on for 50 years, and it has absolutely nothing to do with climate change.
But flooding in Pakistan,
50 years, you have 50 years of climate change.
And desertification. It's also, there's increasing evidence that what's behind the Syria conflict is the same thing, because they've had long-term drought.
No,
it's not a stretch. Well, if you scratch the surface of a lot of these so-called religious wars, you will find at the root of it poverty and jobs. You can look in
poverty
Belfast,
and jobs. That's exactly.
Right, and that's what happened in Syria. No,
but
if you have a long-term drought in Syria, which you did, and a lowering of their ability to feed their own people, you also had the influx of all the refugees from our invasion of Iraq, and suddenly there was tremendous tension of people just to be able to survive.
It was the Arab Spring. It was the Arab Spring that caused Syria.
That. Right, marching
in Syria.
No, I mean, that's so simplistic. Bangladesh is drowning. You know, sea islands are disappearing.
People drown.
Read up on Syria's loss of arable land and their loss of water prior to our invasion of Iraq, and the whole thing is exacerbated.
DoD is not always. Go ahead, Jonathan. Respond.
The fact that there are environmental problems, and in the Middle East there are extremely serious environmental problems that go back literally 2,000 and 3,000 years. In particular, the land of the Middle East has become, over time, more and more salinated. And that's a very serious problem for farmers. But that's not related to climate change. You're talking about desertification in northern Africa. That's a long-standing problem, and it's related to overgrazing. These, again, are not caused by...
Hold on.
But what about...
Let's talk about Bangladesh. Okay. Bangladesh, they have a hurricane in monsoon. 100,000 people can die. We have a hurricane in the United States, 8 people die. Why? Because we are at a higher level of economic development, and we have better homes, and we have We have better roads.
Rich people
and we
have seawalls.
Exactly.
Right? So when
Exactly.
climate change
why New Orleans did
happens,
not.
we
Have to
increase
have-
our seawalls a few meters, and New York can
Well,
survive.
I don't think
but
it's- I don't- I'm
poor
not saying it's
people
that-
are
I'm
actually
not-
going to get hit
Yes.
by climate change much harder
Right.
than wealthy people.
Well, now, hold on.
And that's I'm not saying that there's. I don't think it should be said that there are no consequences of climate change. Though it's worth pointing out some of the consequences of climate change are beneficial. It leads to increases in the amount of precipitation, which makes farming in most of the
some
world
areas,
easier.
in
but
some
not other
areas. How can
places.
you look
That's
at
right.
California?
That's right.
Canada's going
Right.
to, Canada's going to be great with climate
British
change.
wine will be
Yeah.
drinkable.
As in the Middle Ages. As in the Middle Ages.
You know,
When they were
fairly
known for their
modest
wine.
trade-off,
When they were
right?
known their wine. But the point is, we shouldn't have the attitude of everything gets worse, some things get better, some things get worse. But we can't also do things which are going to leave us unable economically to deal with the changes. And we also have to think about dealing with climate change, which I would argue absolutely is taking place. We can't think about dealing with it in simplistic ways or in ways that only benefit some people.
Let's think about the military. They're not only concerned with what has happened over the course of centuries or millennia, they're also concerned about near and intermediate term threats of things that could happen. It's all about threat assessment and threat evaluation. They look at Pakistan, a nuclear-armed power. If you have a dislocation of 30% of the population, which they have experienced due to flooding that is not part of their historic record but has become more frequent, they have to be prepared for the social and political destabilization that results. Isn't that a direct link? Aren't the dominoes between climate change and U.S. military preparedness very direct in that case?
If you were to pick any country over the last 60 years based on environmental issues which you would expect to have war and mass death, it would be Japan. Why? They have very little arable land. The amount of arable land is, I think, about equivalent to the area of the state of Tennessee. They have almost no natural resources. They have regular earthquakes and typhoons. Regular, very serious earthquakes and typhoons. They have not had any civil wars. They have not been invaded by any country. Why? They have a free economy which produces vast resources, not only for themselves but for other countries as well, and that has given them political stability along with a democratic system. The Pentagon should be concerned with promoting the free economic systems and with democracy, because these are the things which we know are least likely to
Promoting
cause these
democracy in
problems.
the Middle East did not work recently.
Right.
I mean, that led to chaos.
It's also the way in which we promote it, right? We bomb you, kill innocent people, and then say, "Oh, come and be free." I mean, it's really ridiculous, and you're just completely minimizing the broader impact of the climate change. It's not just overgrazing that causes problems. It's that the impact of that overgrazing will be vastly worse when we have continued drought, and that's true across Africa. I mean, California is a perfect example.
Right, the California drought doesn't have anything to do with climate change.
It's
Scientists
in
agree.
many
Yes,
different
yes,
ways,
yes,
right?
yes.
But
No, it has
it's
just absolutely nothing to do with
exacerbating-
climate change.
Well, I wouldn't.
Climate,
we
no,
don't
higher
know
global
that.
temperatures is supposed to mean more precipitation in California, not less. It really, and so
Yeah,
this
but
is
there's
the
no-
problem.
but there's
but
no- that's the other
every
thing that people
problem
think-
is like
Hold on,
No,
Melody.
stop.
Let her
I would like to finish. Can I just say that people think that there's, when we say climate change exacerbates it, and no one is saying it's an all or nothing thing, right? To say there's no connection to climate change and the drought in California is ridiculous.
Well, does it?
As
No, but-
much as it is to say all the drought in California is caused by climate change.
No, but
no one
but
is
climate
saying
models
that.
suggest that California is going to get more precipitation under higher global temperatures, not less. So the idea that this drought is,
I don't know who said that.
it's a very that's what climate scientists think is going to happen to California. So the idea that this drought is caused by every single natural disaster now basically people try to tie it back to climate change. And it doesn't result in clear-eyed thinking about these things. And really, I don't understand why the Pentagon is thinking about these things in the first place, because all they can do is assess threats. They can say, okay, this is what's going to happen. I don't understand why what's going to cause, what the particular
They
causes
see
of
climate
droughts
change
is
as
going
a
to be.
threat multiplier,
Right.
in terms of social dislocation.
Well, right. So then they can think about how to
instability,
meet it, and then
insurgency.
so they can think about how to meet it. The idea that then the Pentagon needs to be worried about mitigating climate change itself is just kind of ridiculous. The Pentagon should be figuring out how to handle these problems.
For the instability that's caused.
Yeah, and they
by
could be right or
climate
wrong.
change.
I mean, they're usually wrong about these things.
And again,
as grand
no one is
predictions tend to be.
saying it's all or nothing. No one has said that the drought in California is caused solely by
Well,
climate change. The people on the left mostly say that climate change is exacerbating all of these issues: the droughts, the wildfires, all of that there is a link to climate change, and we don't know exactly what the true impact of climate change is and what is overuse of resources, those kinds of things. But it's a complex, and so why we have to be just adamant against any change, any consideration of efficiency, or Ted Cruz and his voluntary conservation. This was settled policy 40 years ago, that we can't go on destroying the environment and the land and the water and everything else, that we must pay attention and do something about it.
Are still settled policies, and now the Obama administration is trying to use them to tackle climate change, which isn't what they were passed to do.
But it doesn't matter. It's all part and parcel.
So he's actually trying to change the policy.
It's all part and parcel. That the Republicans in Congress have for years tried. They want to do away with the EPA. They want to ignore the Clean Water Act because it might cost a little money to make sure that you don't dump harmful chemicals into the rivers. Look what's happening in the states that don't have, right, in North Carolina, the coal ash that's falling into the rivers and people's drinking water, and they say, well, it's not really having an impact. The oil that's in the rivers from all of these pipeline leaks, it's not really making a difference. And then we find out 10, 15 years later, 9/11, that didn't matter. People could just breathe that in. It wasn't going to be any problem either.
Where does this come from, that the Republican leadership in Congress wants to eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency? In fact, it was a Republican president who signed it into law. I've never heard of any.
It was the Bush administration that launched a huge number of, including some of the alternative energy programs that Republicans criticize now, as if the president
Republicans lost their minds.
The Republicans are generally against
very sane,
environmental
I'm sure.
regulations because it's bad for
half of the presidential
Anders.
candidates want to do away with the EPA.
No, it's absolutely
That's
true
not
that
true.
the Republicans are generally against environmental regulations, as they are many regulations that constrain business because they see it as bad for growth. That's true.
Let's ask this. If the Department of Defense is investing and has been mandated by Congress to invest in alternative energy, why shouldn't the Department of Energy and the EPA ramp up their own efforts?
Well,
should.
Here's a better question. What does the Department of Energy do that's either constitutionally enumerated or beneficial?
What are proven?
Well, they do
Department of
nuclear
Energy
weapons.
successes?
The Department of Energy does nuclear weapons. They do nuclear energy.
No, but in the
all
alternative
of that's
energy,
very important.
say in the alternative energy space, what are real successes that we've seen from the Department of Energy from these
Well,
programs?
they're not getting heavily funded for alternative energy. They need to be funded more for
you're
alternative energy.
You're spending $80 billion a year on.
That's not that
or $80
much.
billion on total.
That's not that much given the threats that are involved.
It seems a fairly substantial investment to have gotten nothing out of it. I mean, the industrial policy tends not to work, and green industrial policy isn't much better.
Military policy seems to work. Everybody celebrates DARPA, for example, the Defense Advanced Research Program. Why not use that model? In fact, aren't we using that model, and isn't it successful? There's an organization called ARPA-E, which develops, and by the way, they target smaller to mid-sized enterprises to do the little things that you tend to miss. I mean, reducing the heat generated in transformers, for example, making sure that the grid connects a little bit better to accept two-way flows of energy so that distributed energy can come into the grid and not just flow out through it. Isn't the problem with, and the reason that we don't have many successes in government-financed alternative energy projects, that they're financed through these tax credits that are incredibly distributed and are not centralized the way that a DARPA or an ARPA-E is structured?
Well,
I think that's a reasonably good argument. I would argue the
opposite. I would argue centralization is bad because then you have one group of people, sort of like Lysenko in the Soviet Union, you have one group of people putting forward their own dumb ideas and other ideas aren't considered. There has been enormous innovation.
DARPA is very distributed. I mean, you've got scientists that have a lot of autonomy, many scientists that are working on many things in DARPA, and that's a very positive program. It brought us the internet. It brought us a lot of excellent things in defense technology, and I think that kind of a model for improving renewable energy, nuclear technology that can solve the particulate problems and the pollution problems is a great idea.
Well, I was going to get to that subject. There's something we haven't talked about, which may make the whole subject, the whole discussion today moot, and that's developments in fusion energy. There have been enormous advances recently in fusion energy. But it's interesting to note, despite the large amount that the federal government has spent on fusion research and other governments have spent on fusion research, the greatest developments recently have been by private industry. Private inventors.
Financed independently or with government financing?
No, with only minimal or no government financing. In fact, in some cases, both in Britain and the United States, there are people who have gone to venture capitalists.
Well, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's use government and let's use private industry.
But it's something we should talk about because nuclear fusion may be the energy of the future. And by the way, it may not be that clean. I mean, we don't really, there was always been this idea, well, you take 2 deuterium and you produce helium and it's completely clean. We don't really know how it's going to wind up as a final source of energy, but it may be a very effective and efficient source of energy, and it may be the future source of energy for most of the world.
The future source of energy for the world, and the future segment right here on The Run.